If you look at the skyline of London, you see a facade of immense, enduring wealth. Glass towers, historic stone, the projected strength of a G7 superpower. But if you look at the data, the cold, hard actuarial tables that govern the life and death of nations, you see something terrifyingly different. The lights are flickering. We are not watching a standard economic recession. We are witnessing the slow motion structural disintegration of one of the world's oldest economies. The United Kingdom isn't just struggling, it is drifting toward a systemic horizon that few major nations have ever survived intact. This is not a story about a bad fiscal quarter. It is a story about a 40-year experiment that has finally run out of runway. For decades, the narrative has been that Britain is a transition economy, moving from industry to services, from coal to finance. But the numbers suggest that the transition didn't lead to a new destination. It led to a hollow center. Psychologically, the nation is suffering from a specific form of cognitive dissonance. The collective memory remembers an empire, a manufacturing giant, and a diplomatic titan. But the economic reality is a country that has stopped building, stopped investing, and stopped growing. The machinery of the state is grinding against gears that were stripped a decade ago. We are looking at a nation where the cost of simply existing is outpacing the ability of the system to generate value. Consider this statistical anomaly. The productivity gap between London and the rest of the UK is now wider than the gap between East and West Germany just before the Berlin Wall fell. That is a staggering metric. It implies that within one island, there are two distinct nations operating with different economic engines. One is a high-finance city-state, the other is a deindustrialized region struggling to maintain basic living standards. When a country's internal economic divergence becomes this extreme, the social contract begins to fray. The nudge here is the realization that money isn't just moving around. It is pooling in specific postcodes while infrastructure everywhere else begins to rot. The railways, the water systems, the energy grid, they are not just old, they are mathematically obsolete, requiring capital injection that the state simply does not have. Why does this matter to you, even if you don't live in Britain? Because the UK is the canary in the coal mine for every Western service-based economy. The struggles of the British household, skyrocketing energy bills, housing that costs 10 times the average salary, and public services that are collapsing under demand are not unique failures. They are the logical endpoint of a system that prioritizes asset inflation over actual production. You feel this in your own grocery bill. You feel this in the rent you pay. The UK is simply arriving at the destination first. It is a lesson in what happens when a country sells off its assets to rent them back at a premium. It is a case study in Rentier capitalism, where wealth is generated by having things rather than doing things. And when that model hits a wall, it hurts the working family first and hardest. The world sees the headlines about strikes and inflation. They think it's a temporary mood swing. But the data suggests something far more permanent is locking into place. The engine hasn't just stalled, the blueprint itself might be flawed, and while the public is focused on the symptoms, the prices, the queues, the potholes, the real crisis is happening in a dark room in the bond markets where the math is starting to whisper a word that terrifies economists. To understand if a collapse is imminent, we have to look under the hood at the mechanics of the engine, and the mechanics report is brutal. The United Kingdom has stopped investing in its own future. This is not a poetic exaggeration, it is a literal accounting fact. For the last 2 decades, capital investment in Britain, funding for machinery, technology, buildings, and infrastructure, has been consistently lower than almost every other advanced economy. This brings us to a phenomenon economists call the low-growth trap. It works like quicksand. Because the economy isn't growing, tax revenue is stagnant. Because revenue is stagnant, the government cannot invest in infrastructure or education. Because they cannot invest, productivity remains low. And because productivity is low, the economy doesn't grow. The psychology of the institutions involved has shifted from ambition to preservation. When you look at the London Stock Exchange, you don't see the world's newest tech giants or innovative disruptors. You see old economy banks, oil companies, and miners. It is a museum economy, lucrative, respectable, but fundamentally looking backward. The hidden mechanic here is a risk aversion so profound that it looks like paralysis. The capital is there, but it is trapped in property speculation rather than business creation. But here is the twist that escalates the tension. The UK has accidentally engineered an economy that is addicted to expensive housing. The primary way the average British citizen builds wealth is not through entrepreneurship or wage growth, but by their house increasing in value. This creates a perverse incentive. If the government fixes the housing crisis by building millions of homes, prices would drop, and the wealth of the voting majority would evaporate overnight. So, the system is designed to keep housing scarce and expensive. This suffocates the younger generation, stripping them of disposable income that should be flowing into the wider economy. It is a self-imposed embargo on growth, where the asset wealth of the old is protected at the direct expense of the economic vitality of the young. This is where the behavioral economics becomes personal. If you are under 40 in a system like this, the social contract feels void. You are asked to pay high taxes for services you can't access, to support a pension system you may never benefit from, all while being locked out of the asset market. This drains a nation of its most vital resource, optimism. When a population believes that hard work no longer correlates with upward mobility, productivity collapses not because of machinery, but because of morale. It creates a phenomenon known as quiet quitting on a national scale. Why participate in a game that is mathematically rigged against you? This isn't just an economic issue. It is a psychological crisis that bleeds into culture, crime, and social cohesion. The internal machinery is seized. The housing market is a vampire draining the real economy. The investment tap is dry. But if you think the internal problems are bad, they pale in comparison to what is happening on the global stage. Because for the first time in centuries, the island is finding itself alone in a room full of giants, and the protection of the past is wearing thin. But here's the part nobody expected. The biggest threat to the UK isn't coming from its enemies, it's coming from its friends. In the ruthless theater of geopolitics, sentimentality has zero value. The world does not care about history, it cares about leverage. And the brutal truth is that the United Kingdom has voluntarily unplugged itself from its primary trading bloc without securing a viable alternative. We are watching a mid-sized nation attempt to float alone in an ocean dominated by massive continental superpowers. This goes beyond the politics of recent years. This is about market gravity. The hidden structural shift here is the loss of gateway status. For decades, global corporations set up headquarters in London to access the European market. That utility is gone. Now investors are asking a colder question: why here? If you want Europe, you go to Dublin, Frankfurt, or Paris. If you want a dynamic deregulation experiment, you go to Singapore or Dubai. The UK is currently stuck in the unhappy middle. Taxes are too high to be a tax haven, but services are too poor to be a high-tax social democracy. It is an identity crisis played out in currency markets. There is a historical parallel here that chills historians: the Suez Crisis of 1956. That was the moment Britain realized it was no longer a military superpower. We are now living through the economic Suez. It is the realization that the British pound is no longer a reserve currency that can weather any storm. In recent years, we have seen the pound trade like an emerging market currency, highly volatile and sensitive to political instability. That is a massive signal failure. When the bond vigilantes, the international investors who fund government debt, start treating G7 debt like a risky bet, the game changes. The cost of borrowing rises, eating up more of the national budget, leaving even less for the hospitals and schools we mentioned earlier. It is a death spiral of confidence. For the global citizen, this is a lesson in connectivity. We live in an era of supply chains and alliances. The idea of sovereignty in a hyper-connected global economy is an expensive illusion. When a country adds friction to its trade, paperwork, checks, delays, it simply makes itself poorer. We are seeing the behavioral economics of loss aversion on a national level. The country is trying to hold on to the prestige of the past, while the economic logic of the present erodes beneath its feet. Other nations are watching closely. The UK is becoming a case study for what happens when you prioritize political ideology over economic pragmatism. It is a warning. Isolation is expensive. The world is moving on. Trade routes are being redrawn around the island, not through it. The diplomatic phone calls are shorter. The special relationship is becoming more of a nostalgic courtesy than a strategic necessity. But as the geopolitical walls close in, the pressure inside the pressure cooker is reaching a critical point. The external isolation is driving internal fracture. And this leads us to the final, most dangerous reality. Because while the economists worry about the numbers, the real collapse isn't financial. It gets deeper, it's social. Ultimately, nations do not collapse on spreadsheets. They collapse in waiting rooms, in cold living rooms, and in the quiet desperation of families who played by the rules and lost. The real-world impact of this systemic entropy is the erosion of the institutions of daily life. When you call an ambulance and it doesn't come, when the police stop investigating burglary, when the trains don't run, the state effectively breaches its contract with the citizen. The media discusses inflation figures, but they are missing the silent evacuation. The brain drain. The UK is currently experiencing an exodus of its brightest talent. Doctors, engineers, researchers, moving to Australia, Canada, or the US for better wages and working conditions. This is the hidden killer. You can print money, but you cannot print a 30-year-old surgeon. When the human capital leaves, the capacity for recovery leaves with them. We are seeing a demographic inversion where the tax base is shrinking while the demand for care is exploding. It is a mathematical pincer movement that no amount of political rhetoric can solve. But here is the pattern interrupt. The collapse might not look like an explosion. It might not look like a revolution or a sudden crash. It looks like a slow, manageable decline. It looks like good enough. It looks like getting used to things being slightly worse every single year. This is the danger of normalization. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We adapt to the potholes, we adapt to the waiting lists, we adapt to the lower standard of living. The collapse isn't a singular event. It is a process of lowering expectations until the unacceptable becomes the routine. The UK isn't falling off a cliff. It is sliding down a gentle slope, and the view is so familiar that no one is pulling the emergency brake. This matters to you because the UK is the test subject for the post-growth Western world. If a stable, wealthy, historic democracy can hollow out from the inside, it can happen anywhere. It forces us to ask, what is the purpose of an economy? Is it to increase the numbers on a stock ticker, or is it to facilitate a good life for the people who live within it? If the UK cannot answer that question, if it cannot pivot from a rentier economy back to a productive one, then the collapse is not a possibility, it is a current event. The island is at a crossroads. One path leads to a managed decline, a museum of past glories. The other requires a radical, painful reinvention that no one seems brave enough to propose. But while the world is fixated on the drama in London, the real transformation is already unfolding, quietly, and in a place no one expects. The power is shifting, and the next video will show you exactly where it's going.